I still remember the first time I heard the legend of the ghost train, told in hushed whispers by my grandfather on a stormy evening, his voice trembling as he recounted a haunting encounter from his youth. And though I initially dismissed it as a fireside tale meant to spook wide-eyed children, the memory of his fearful expression never truly left me. The story involved an abandoned railway line that cut through our mist-shrouded forest, a track so twisted by time and neglect that most folks assumed no locomotive could ever pass that way again. Yet rumor claimed that on certain moonless nights, one might hear the unmistakable rattle of wheels and the mournful whistle of a train that simply had no earthly reason to be there. My grandfather insisted that if you dared to stand near the old trestle bridge beyond town on the correct evening, you would see a faint glow emerging from the darkness, followed by a phantom engine chugging along, its windows lit with an unholy luminescence, and its interior crammed full of silent figures that never blinked or breathed. His account always ended the same way, an admonition to never investigate the tracks at night, to never challenge whatever otherworldly presence powered that spectral locomotive. Yet as I grew older, I felt my curiosity outweigh my caution, drawn to the idea that there might be a realm where time and logic bent to accommodate the dead's final journey. I was barely into my 20s when I finally worked up the nerve to explore the abandoned railway myself, telling no one of my plan, my heart pounding as I slipped into the dense woods with only a flashlight and a firm resolve to see the truth for myself. The path was overgrown with thorny vines and tangled roots that seemed determined to slow my progress, and every snapping twig or rustling branch sent my nerves into a frenzy, as if the forest itself conspired to turn me back. Through the gloom of twilight, I caught sight of the old rails, rusted and half-buried under layers of moss, leading deeper into the forest's silent depths, a relic of a once thriving route that had collapsed under mysterious circumstances decades ago. My flashlight beam flickered across battered railroad ties, each one a silent testament to vanished travelers, and an unsettling hush pervaded the area, so complete that even the usual chirps of nocturnal insects seemed stifled, as if the land knew my intentions and held its breath in anticipation. The trestle bridge loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of rotted beams spanning a rocky ravine, and though the boards creaked ominously under my tentative footsteps, I forced myself to continue, determined to reach the midpoint where my grandfather claimed the ghost train would sometimes appear. Darkness fell rapidly, swallowing the last hints of twilight, and I found myself scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, half hoping to see that eerie glow and half wishing the entire legend was nonsense so I could return home and laugh about my wasted efforts. At first, all I noticed was the swirling mist that seemed to thicken around the bridge, rolling in from the ravine below, curling around the twisted metal braces in a slow dance of vapor that set my teeth on edge. I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if the swirling shapes in the fog actually resembled faces, contorted in silent screams, vanishing each time I tried to focus on them. Determined to keep my composure, I set up a small campsite near the trestle's center, just a humble ring of stones and a lantern, telling myself I would wait until midnight to see if anything uncanny stirred within the forest shadows. Each passing minute felt like an hour, and the wind's occasional moan through the treetops sounded disconcertingly like distant cries. But I huddled beside my lantern and reread my grandfather's journal entries, where he had meticulously recorded local rumors of lost trains and ill-fated engineers. A single entry caught my eye, a reference to a catastrophic accident that had supposedly happened on this very line, the train derailing one stormy night and plunging into the ravine. Its passengers never recovered, their restless spirits rumored to linger, waiting for a ride that would never end. My skin prickled as I wondered if that doomed engine was the same ghost train reported by generations of locals, and I couldn't shake the image of wraith-like passengers peering from dusty windows, trapped in an endless loop of spectral travel. By the time midnight approached, an otherworldly silence blanketed the area, so profound that even the rustle of my jacket seemed deafening, and the hair on the back of my neck stood stiff when I noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration in the rails beneath my feet. The metal tremor reminded me of an approaching locomotive, the subtle rumble one would feel before a train thundered by. Except these tracks were broken and decayed, no longer connected to any living route, which meant there was no logical explanation for the sensation beneath my boots. Then came the whistle, soft at first, a distant wail that could have been mistaken for wind in the pines, but as I strained my ears, it rose in pitch and clarity, transforming into the unmistakable call of a train's horn, forlorn and echoing, carried by a breeze that smelled faintly of coal smoke. My hands shook as I scanned the track with my flashlight, catching only drifting mist and the rotting beams, until a pale glow flickered at the far edge of the trestle, an ethereal light that shimmered like phosphorescent haze. Eyes locked on that glow, I watched it grow brighter, coalescing into what looked like an old-fashioned locomotive headlamp, except its luminosity was sickly, as if it drew power from the moonless sky rather than any mechanical source. My legs threatened to give out as I realized I was witnessing the legend in real time. The ghost train was manifesting, the rails humming louder as though welcoming the arrival of a spectral behemoth. With each heartbeat, the glow intensified, and behind it formed the silhouette of a locomotive engine, ghostly metal shimmering in the darkness. Wheels that didn't seem to connect with the rails, turning in slow motion as if defying normal physics. The hiss of steam reached my ears, accompanied by a swirl of phantom smoke that curled upward before dissolving into the starless night, giving the impression of a train running on intangible fuel, fueled by centuries of sorrow and longing. Stunned, I cowered against one of the trestle supports, my flashlight beam darting wildly across the shifting shape of the train, trying to reconcile the sight of battered carriages that flickered between solidity and translucence, each window faintly lit from within. Faces pressed against those windows, pale, expressionless faces that gazed out with hollow eyes, their mouths slack, as if caught in an eternal moment of shock or despair, and I nearly dropped my flashlight when I realized one of them was staring directly at me. Time seemed to warp as the train rolled toward me. The sound of wheels on rails more akin to a funereal dirge than a typical clackety-clack, each rotation underscored by a metallic groan that resonated in my bones, setting my teeth on edge. A wave of cold air washed over me, sharp enough to sting my lungs, and I heard distant whispers emanating from the open windows, fragments of conversation in archaic accents, pleas for help, or final confessions echoing through the night. The locomotive slowed at the center of the bridge, not stopping fully but crawling forward at a dreamlike pace, and I stared in dumbstruck awe at the battered nameplate on its side, corroded letters that spelled out something I couldn't read, as though the train itself hailed from an era long lost. Shaking with equal parts terror and curiosity, I inched closer, my footfalls echoing on the rotten boards, and to my amazement, one of the carriage doors glided open with a soft creak, revealing a corridor lit by flickering lanterns that offered no warmth. A shape emerged from the doorway, a conductor, or the ghostly facsimile of one, dressed in tattered uniform that shimmered in and out of focus, his hollow eyes fixed on me as he lifted a pale hand, beckoning me to board. My mind screamed to flee, to run back to the safety of real ground, but some unstoppable force inside me yearned to uncover the secrets of this spectral train, to confirm whether the souls trapped within truly lingered in endless transit, oblivious to the passage of centuries. Summoning courage I didn't know I possessed, I stepped forward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and reached the open doorway, glimpsing passengers slumped in seats, their heads lolling, each figure flickering with each passing second as though not fully anchored in our reality. The conductor's voice reached me in a raspy whisper, barely audible over the moan of the wind. "One way or round trip?" he asked, the question sending a chill down my spine as I realized how literal his meaning might be. Once on board, I might never return to the living world. Nonetheless, I placed a trembling foot on the first step, feeling an electric jolt shoot up my leg, a shock that made me gasp as the train's air enveloped me, thick with the odor of mildew and old smoke, tinted by an unmistakable undertone of despair. The conductor stepped aside, granting me entry, and I found myself in a corridor lined with dusty seats, each one occupied by a silent traveler whose vacant stares seemed fixed on some distant horizon, as if they were replaying their final moments over and over without escape. Before I could fully process the sight, the train lurched forward, wheels screeching in a shrill cacophony that resonated in my skull, and outside the windows, the forest whirled by in a distorted blur, indicating that the locomotive had achieved an impossible speed in mere seconds. The overhead lanterns flickered madly, and ghostly footsteps echoed behind me, suggesting that unseen passengers roamed the carriages at will, their faint murmurs weaving a tapestry of regrets and lost dreams. My fear redoubled when I saw something far worse. The rails outside no longer appeared broken, but sleek and new, glowing with spectral luminescence, as though we had slipped into a timeline where the railway was still intact, carrying its doomed cargo to a fate sealed by tragedy. Each breath felt like inhaling icy needles, my lungs burning with cold, and I wondered if the train was draining the warmth from my body, absorbing my life force to prolong its endless journey. Then, just as I felt my consciousness waver, the engine screeched again, and the train slowed abruptly, the windows revealing a decaying station platform bathed in pale moonlight, cracks in the cement mirrored by twisted vines that clung to rotting beams. The conductor reappeared at my side, gesturing for me to disembark, his hollow gaze unwavering, and I realized with startling clarity that if I lingered, I might become one of these lost souls, forever traveling under a moon that never quite sets, bound to the ghost train's cyclical route. Summoning a final burst of will, I stumbled onto the platform, nearly collapsing when my legs met solid ground. and the moment my feet left the carriage steps, the entire train blurred at the edges, the wheels grinding in one final, ear-splitting protest as the locomotive lurched into motion again. I staggered backward, heart in my throat, watching that spectral engine vanish into a swirl of fog, leaving behind only a faint echo of clattering wheels and a receding whistle that tugged at my soul like a siren call, urging me to follow. Darkness enveloped the station once more, the hush so absolute that I questioned everything had been an elaborate hallucination conjured by exhaustion. But my trembling limbs and the cold sweat on my brow insisted otherwise. Unable to stand any longer, I sank to the ground, struggling to breathe, and I realized I recognized the station from old photographs, a once proud hub in our county, long since abandoned and partially demolished, yet it shimmered around me in half-ruined glory, bridging the gap between the past and the present. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to navigate the overgrown tracks back to the trestle, each step a grueling battle against confusion and fear, not stopping until I reached my campsite, where the dawn's first light revealed that the rails were indeed broken, the locomotive's path physically impossible by any natural measure. My mind reeled with the knowledge that I had boarded a train that should not exist, glimpsed souls who never found peace, and escaped only by a fragile stroke of luck, perhaps because the ghost train allowed it. Collapsing by my abandoned lantern, I vowed to share my story, to caution that the legend of the ghost train was no mere fireside yarn. Though I suspected few would believe me, and many would laugh off the claim that a phantom railway hauls the dead through moonlit forests. Still, I carry the memory of that silent conductor and the echoing whistle within me, haunted by a single question that keeps me awake at night. If the ghost train's route truly transcends the boundaries of life and death, how many lost souls out there are destined to board it, never to return? And in the hush of each new twilight, when the wind stirs the pines in a sigh that almost resembles a distant whistle, I find myself wondering if one day I, too, will hear that spectral locomotive rattling toward me, ready to reclaim any who dared slip from its grasp. I kept my secret about boarding the ghost train locked away for days, torn between the raw terror of the memory and a bizarre sense of longing that refused to fade, until a chance conversation with an elderly librarian spurred me to dig deeper into the train's history, convinced that I needed to understand its origins to banish the nightmares that now plagued my every sleep. From the moment I stepped inside her dusty office, lined with leather-bound books and old county records, I sensed she knew more than she initially let on, especially when her eyes flickered with recognition at the mere mention of an abandoned trestle in the forest and a phantom locomotive rumored to pass by under moonless skies. When I finally confessed that I had seen the train myself, describing flickering windows filled with pale, motionless passengers and a conductor who beckoned me on board, she leaned forward, wrinkles creasing around her eyes, and told me in a trembling whisper that she had once lost a cousin to that same haunted route decades ago. She explained that local records mentioned a fatal derailment, one that sent a passenger train plunging off a ravine bridge long before our time, though official documents never detail the exact cause. And to this day, many believe the wreck's victims were never fully recovered from the twisted wreckage below. Her cousin, she said, vanished on a night eerily similar to the one I described. No moon, an unnatural stillness in the air, and rumors of a ghostly whistle echoing through the pines, only to be found days later wandering near the tracks, incoherent and white-haired from shock, muttering about doors that led to nowhere. Stricken by the parallels, I pressed her for more information, and she handed me a faded folder stuffed with newspaper clippings, unsolved missing persons reports, and half-legible notes scrawled by local historians, each hinting that every few years, someone encountered this ghost train, returning with stories of silent compartments, flickering lanterns, and restless souls trapped in an endless loop. As I pored over the clippings, I found references to multiple generations of witnesses who shared eerily similar accounts, glimpsing the same conductor, wearing an impossibly outdated uniform, or hearing muffled pleas emanating from compartments whose doors wouldn't open, leaving these watchers with unresolved guilt or dread. One newspaper snippet stood out, an article from 1923 describing how a newlywed couple disappeared during a late-night hike near the defunct railway, their footprints discovered leading onto the rotted trestle but never coming off, and search parties found only a single rose lying on the old rails, glistening with morning dew. Another piece from the early 1950s told of a man who returned after weeks presumed missing, claiming he had been a passenger on a train that traveled through a landscape of unending twilight, where time twisted upon itself and each carriage was stuffed with the unspoken regrets of those who boarded. Though labeled delusional by authorities, he reportedly died in his sleep a month later, found clutching a yellowed train ticket that no one recognized, printed in a language no living soul could decipher. Determined to reconcile these legends with my own harrowing experience, I decided to retrace my steps to the forest trestle, but this time armed with more than a single flashlight and a naive sense of adventure, I packed rations, a camera, a handheld voice recorder, and a silver pendant gifted by the librarian, who insisted it had once belonged to her ill-fated cousin as a form of protective charm. My second trip to the tracks felt heavier, as though each step was layered with the knowledge that countless others had ventured here before, some returning forever changed, others never returning at all, and the looming pines around me creaked like silent sentinels, warning me that I trespassed upon a realm the living weren't meant to disturb. The sun was setting by the time I reached the trestle, its beams casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the weatherboards, and my heart pounded with a memory of the unearthly glow I had witnessed previously, unsure if the ghost train would indeed appear on consecutive nights or if it demanded an unknown cycle to manifest. For several hours, I sat in tense silence, voice recorder at the ready, ignoring the creeping chill that sank into my bones as night deepened, until the hush of the forest pressed so tightly that I half believed I could hear my own blood coursing through my veins. Just as my eyelids grew heavy with fatigue, the faintest tremor vibrated through the rails beneath my boots, accompanied by that low, distant whistle I had prayed never to hear again. An adrenaline shot through me like lightning, driving away all drowsiness in an instant. My camera's lens shook as I scrambled to capture the first flickers of ghostly light that shimmered at the far edge of the track, a phosphorescent haze forming the vague outline of the engine, flickering in and out of existence like a stuttering heartbeat. Unlike my first encounter, this manifestation seemed hesitant at first, as though the train was testing my resolve, or perhaps gauging the presence of the protective charm I wore, each will emerging slowly from the darkness, forging its shape from drifting sparks of pale luminescence. I could hardly breathe when the train fully materialized, steam hissing from its phantom pipes, but I pressed the record button on my voice recorder and whispered into the microphone a plea for the lost souls to speak, hoping I might glean answers to the riddle of their endless journey. Instantly, a gust of cold wind slammed into me, rattling the trestle so violently I feared it might collapse. Yet I held my ground, heart hammering, as the train's doors slid open, releasing a wave of frigid air that smelled of old metal and funerary incense, though I couldn't see any visible source for that scent. Stepping forward just enough to peer inside, I saw row upon row of passengers with vacant stares, each seat revealing a new face contorted with some private torment, their clothes spanning decades of fashion, as if the train had collected travelers from different eras, fusing them into one sorrowful congregation. My voice recorder crackled with interference, though faint words in multiple languages emerged from the static, pleas that overlapped into a surreal chorus, each voice trembling with desperation, as if begging for help to break free of the locomotive's eternal cycle, or perhaps urging me to flee before I shared their fate. The conductor stood in the aisle, hat tilted low to mask his eyes, but the lines of his jaw were set in a grim expression, and though he did not speak, I felt a silent challenge radiating from him, as if he recognized me from our last encounter and resented that I had escaped. Despite every instinct screaming to run, I inched closer, determined to discover if there was a method to end this haunting, to lay these souls to rest, or if the train itself was cursed beyond redemption, an endless corridor of sorrowful illusions. A flicker at the corner of my eye drew my attention to a lone passenger who seemed more animated than the others, a woman in a black dress whose lips quivered with unspoken words, tears glistening on her translucent cheeks, her eyes locked on me with a silent plea. Summoning courage, I approached her seat, ignoring the conductor's disapproving glare, and as I knelt to meet her gaze, I felt a freezing hand grip my wrist, sending a jolt through my arm that nearly knocked me backward. But I resisted, murmuring softly, "What do you need?" Her lips moved without sound, forming a single word, "home." And in that moment, I understood that the lost souls aboard this train might be bound by an unfulfilled desire, a yearning for closure that tethered them to a realm between life and death, trapped in perpetual transit. Waves of pity mingled with dread as I gently pried my wrist free, and though she did not resist, a look of profound sorrow deepened in her glassy eyes, as if she realized I could do nothing more than bear witness to her captivity. A hollow groan signaled the train's intention to depart, and the conductor advanced with an authoritative stride, lifting a spectral lantern that glowed with a pale flame, gesturing for me to step aside or perhaps be forcibly seated among the ghostly ranks if I did not comply. Sensing the danger, I hastily stumbled off the carriage, nearly tripping over the threshold as the train jolted, starting down the track with slow, grinding movement, each wheel squealing in protest, the entire locomotive dissolving at the edges like an unraveling tapestry. In a last desperate attempt, I shouted after them, asking how to release the passengers, how to end the curse, but the conductor only turned his head slightly, giving me a fleeting glimpse of empty sockets where eyes should have been, a silent condemnation that chilled me to the core. Within seconds, the train accelerated to an impossible velocity, vanishing into a swirl of luminous smoke that trailed off into the starless sky, leaving the trestle deserted except for the echo of screeching wheels that lingered in my ears long after the final glow had faded. I sank to my knees, chest heaving, consumed by the enormity of what I had witnessed. The camera still clutched in my trembling hands, lens pointed uselessly at empty rails that gave no evidence of the monstrous train's passage. In a daze, I replayed the recording on my voice recorder, straining to decipher the static-laced whispers, only to uncover faint sobs and inaudible pleas, a cacophony of anguished voices so layered that it was impossible to isolate a single coherent message beyond the shared longing for release. Overwhelmed, I trudged back to town at dawn, footfalls heavy on the dew-laden leaves, each branch scratching at my jacket like bony fingers seeking to pull me back, as if the forest itself conspired with the ghost train to keep me forever entangled in its unearthly domain. Once home, I collapsed into bed, haunted by fleeting images of sorrowful passengers, the hollow stare of the conductor, and the desperate word home repeated in my mind, driving me to a near-sleepless haze of guilt and determination to find a way to set them free if such a thing was remotely possible. Over the next weeks, I sought out mediums, historians, and folklore experts, describing my experiences with guarded caution, omitting certain details to avoid outright ridicule, yet hoping someone might know of an ancient rite or exorcism to release trapped spirits from an endless railway crossing the boundaries of life and death. Some dismissed me as a delusional thrill-seeker, others offered vague condolences, but a few recognized the spectral train legend from their own regions, acknowledging that ghostly locomotives appeared in myths worldwide, always bearing unresolved regrets and carrying souls that lingered in perpetual transit. Through painstaking research, I pieced together a theory. The train functioned as a liminal vessel, drawn to places where tragedy had broken the chain of life's normal progression, binding victims to an unfinished journey, each passenger's longing fueling the locomotive's ephemeral existence. My hopes soared at the possibility that if we could find the remains of the original wreck, or if we discovered the unmarked graves of those who never received proper rites, we might sever the train's connection to our realm, granting the lost travelers a final departure. Yet a gnawing doubt warned me that tampering with such potent forces could lead to even darker manifestations, especially considering the conductor's silent malice and the sense that the train resisted interference from the living, punishing those who pried too deeply. Nonetheless, I pressed on, crossing into the next county to scour old archives for records of the ill-fated train crash, discovering a rumor that the engineer had been warned about a failing trestle but ignored the caution in a rush to meet the timetable, dooming all aboard in a single horrifying plunge. Further digging revealed a contradictory account suggesting the track had been sabotaged by bandits looking to loot cargo, and that the souls of the passengers, robbed of a peaceful end, remain forever lost in a half-reality, embodied by the phantom locomotive that roams under moonless skies. Alone in my cramped apartment, I stacked up dusty ledgers and fragile newspapers, my table overflowing with half-solved mysteries, while the voice recorder sat front and center, a silent witness to that second ride's anguish, still crackling with faint echoes of despair whenever I dared replay it. Fear consumed my every moment, for I knew the ghost train might reappear at any time, and a chilling part of me dreaded the conductor's wrath for meddling in secrets that defied mortal comprehension. Yet another part believed I had a duty to free the unwitting passengers. When a librarian, my lone confidant, suggested we attempt a communal ritual at the wreck site if we could locate it in the ravine, I felt a surge of hope, imagining that perhaps we could guide those spirits to genuine rest, even if it meant confronting the spectral engine one final time under the looming threat of no return. Preparations began in earnest, gathering candles, reading about threshold ceremonies in old spiritual texts, and enlisting a small group of believers, locals who had lost loved ones near the cursed rails, or had glimpsed the train's glow and sought closure for their nightmares. Each day before the planned vigil, I felt the air grow colder and heavier, as if the train's presence encroached on my life, waiting to see if I dared challenge its domain or would cower in silence. At last, the night arrived, a sliver of moon hidden by thick clouds, and our small congregation tiptoed through the woods, determined to descend into the ravine where twisted beams of the original wreck might still lie, bridging the gap between the living and that sorrowful realm of drifting souls. Despite the protective charms and hushed prayers, every snap of a twig made my heart lurch, reminding me how deeply I feared the conductor's gaze, yet forging on in the name of those silent passengers who had no voice but the echoing sobs on my recorder. Reaching the site, we found ancient debris half consumed by earth and foliage, corroded metal fragments that undoubtedly belonged to a derailed train, yet the thick mist snaking through the ravine obscured everything beyond a short radius, forcing us to rely on candlelight to keep from stumbling. One by one, we lit our candles, encircling the wreckage, reciting a carefully pieced-together rite intended to honor the dead, to apologize for the tragedy that bound them, and to invite them to pass beyond the mortal plane without further anguish. An unearthly wind rose from nowhere, snuffing out half our candles, and in the flickering gloom, a low rumble thrummed through the ground, reminiscent of the locomotive's approach, though the rails overhead remained broken and motionless, mocking the logic that no train could physically pass. Determined not to waver, we raised our voices, chanting words of farewell, summoning every ounce of compassion for the souls in limbo, my own heart pounding with the memory of that lonely passenger who had mouthed home in the carriage. Then, from above the ridge, the faint glow of the ghost train took shape, gliding across the shattered trestle with impossible grace, wheels rotating in slow arcs, the entire engine throbbing with an iridescent luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. As it came into view, the conductor's silhouette loomed at the front, lantern raised high, and in the ambient hush, I sensed his fury at our intrusion, a psychic wave of condemnation that threatened to freeze my blood in my veins. Yet we pressed on, chanting the final lines of the ceremony, urging the passengers to break free of their purgatorial cycle, reminding them that the living world did not hold them anymore, that they deserved rest beyond the endless rails. A howling shriek erupted from the engine, metal scraping on metal, and spectral smoke cascaded into the ravine, forming wraith-like figures that writhed in agony before dissipating under the glow of our candles, as though uncertain whether to vanish or coalesce into something monstrous. The final beat of our chant unleashed a surge of cold air, nearly toppling us, and in that swirling chaos, the ghost train's shape faltered, edges disintegrating into a flurry of sparks. The conductor's expression twisted in silent rage as he locked eyes with me for a single harrowing instant, his hollow gaze spelling both vengeance and sorrow. Then, just like that, the locomotive cracked apart, each carriage fading into scattered motes of pale light, drifting upward on a phantom breeze. And for a moment, we heard a collective sigh that reverberated through the ravine, half relief, half lament, echoing across decades of entrapment. Collapsing to my knees, I felt tears burning my eyes, uncertain if our ritual had truly freed them or merely scattered them to the four winds. But one thing was clear. The presence of the spectral train had lifted, the crushing weight in the air replaced by a fragile serenity that felt like dawn after a storm. In the hush that followed, our candles flickered bravely, reflecting in the rivulets of water trickling down mossy rocks, and I sensed that while we might never fully understand the magnitude of what we'd done, we had at least pried open a door for those souls to find release, or perhaps another path. Exhausted, we clung to one another, uncertain if the conductor would return to claim retribution or if our contrition had forced him to cede the railway at last, leaving only rust and echoes behind. But something in me believed the cycle was broken, that the final whistle had at last been blown. I spent days in a haze of relief and disbelief, wrestling with the fragile hope that our final ritual in the ravine had ended the ghost train's long, sorrowful journey. Yet a sliver of uncertainty tugged at my mind, reminding me that not all curses are so easily dispelled, and that the silence in those forests might merely be a lull before a final reckoning. Even so, when I returned to the site of the derelict trestle a week later, the atmosphere felt undeniably lighter, free from the suffocating gloom that once pressed against every thought, and no trace of spectral light or distant whistles disturbed the afternoon calm, as though the haunted air had been cleansed of something malign. My small band of fellow believers, those who joined me in chanting the rites, gathered sporadically in my cramped apartment to share anxious updates, each of us half expecting we hear rumors of new sightings or vanishings. But for the most part, the local rumor mill went silent, focusing instead on everyday matters that lacked any mention of railbound apparitions. I couldn't decide if the quiet was a blessing or a sinister calm, but I tried to resume some semblance of normalcy, plunging into overdue tasks at work, replying to old emails, and forcing myself to sleep without replaying visions of ghostly windows in my mind, though the memory of that sorrowful passenger mouthing the word home still came to me in dreams. Months passed without a single reported incident of phantom whistles in the night, and while the story of the ghost train persisted in the region's folklore, retold by old-timers in weathered rocking chairs, the sense of urgency faded, replaced by the usual cyclical nature of local legends that rise and fall with the seasons. I found myself cautiously optimistic, even daring to walk the edges of the old railway tracks at dusk to confirm there were no stray glimmers haunting the rusted rails, and though goosebumps crept over my arms, I encountered only silence, the forest reclaiming the path inch by inch. In my personal time, I continued scouring history books and diaries, determined to record what we'd experienced, convinced that one day, future generations might need evidence or guidance should the ghost train ever resurface, a possibility I still viewed with a mixture of dread and resignation. Some nights, I'd reread the voice transcriptions I painstakingly took from that static-laced recorder, gleaning only fragments of lost voices, half-formed regrets, or pleas for forgiveness, all overshadowed by occasional bursts of static that almost sounded like a low, mournful whistle. One rainy evening, the librarian, my confidant in these esoteric matters, knocked on my door, her eyes alight with excitement as she presented me with a tattered envelope she found tucked in an old genealogical record, addressed to a name that matched a victim of a historic derailment, sealed with a wax crest shaped like a train wheel. Inside was a letter that read like a heartfelt apology from the railway's original owners, expressing remorse for overlooked safety concerns and vowing to expedite track repairs, never mailed because the accident happened before it could be delivered, leaving the apology forever unsent. Reading that letter, I felt a shiver of recognition, imagining how many of those lost souls clung to unfinished business, messages of hope or repentance that never reached their intended recipients, perhaps fueling the train's endless circuit of longing. Spurred by this new discovery, I decided to take the letter to the ravine one final time, standing at the edge of the collapsed wreck where we once performed a contrition ritual, quietly reading the apology aloud, hoping any spirits still lingering might find closure in words they were denied decades ago. The moment I finished, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, startling a small shower of droplets that cascaded upon me like tears of relief. And though I heard no spectral whistles or saw no flickers in the gloom, a soft warmth settled over the sight that felt akin to acceptance, as though an old wound had finally begun to heal. Returning to my apartment that night, I slept with an unburdened heart for the first time in ages, relieved to have offered a final gesture of restitution, no matter how small, for those doomed travelers who might still roam the edges of memory. After that evening, my nightmares of the conductor's empty sockets lessened, replaced by more mundane dreams, though I still occasionally jolted awake with the phantom sensation of a rail's vibration underfoot or the echo of a whistle reverberating in the back of my mind. Over time, life marched forward in its usual pattern, and the intense fervor surrounding the ghost train sightings faded into local myth, a cautionary tale recounted during harvest festivals or around winter fireplaces, with younger crowds rolling their eyes at the thought of intangible locomotives. But for me, the memory never dulled. Every glance at an old railway track or the worn conductor's punch I kept from the library archives reminded me of the line between the living and the lingering dead, a boundary we had unknowingly tested and perhaps temporarily dissolved. Months turned into years, and the forest reclaimed even more of the dilapidated rails, saplings sprouting among rusted ties, as though nature sought to bury the past under fresh growth, a silent eulogy for the tragedies that shaped our rural corner of the world. Occasionally, out-of-town thrill-seekers arrived, brandishing ghost-hunting gadgets and nerve-fueled bravado, determined to find evidence of the ghost train themselves. But inevitably, they returned empty-handed, spooked only by the isolation of the woods rather than any legitimate spectral sighting. I watched them from afar with mixed emotions, part of me tempted to warn them off in earnest, but another part resigned to let them discover the emptiness for themselves, hoping no hidden echo of the train might actually respond to their prodding and drag them into its realm. Despite the official hush, rumors would surface now and then, a lone hiker claiming to see lights among the trees at midnight, or a passing motorist insisting they heard a faraway whistle during a new moon. But no conclusive sign emerged, leading most to dismiss such anecdotes as fantasies born of the legend allure. Now and then, Morgan and I, still close in the aftermath of our shared ordeal, visited the site of our original vigil, placing a few wildflowers near the ravine to honor the memory of those lost passengers, neither of us voicing the lingering fear that the ghost train might reappear if we let ourselves forget. On one such occasion, we stumbled upon footprints pressed into the mud, too fresh to be from old explorers, leading dangerously close to the collapsed remains of the original wreck, only to vanish abruptly at a sharp drop, the final imprint twisting as though whoever stood there was dragged away by invisible hands. Immediately, a familiar dread clenched my stomach, but Morgan and I found no sign of disturbed metal or spectral residue, no footprints returning from the brink, leaving us to guess that it might have been an unfortunate wanderer or a deer's misstep in the soft ground, even though the shape of the imprint looked unnervingly human. Unable to quell our nerves, we left the ravine more quickly than usual, hearts pounding as we recalled how easily the ghost train had ensnared others, and we spent the next few days combing the local news, bracing for a missing person report that never surfaced. After that scare, I redoubled my efforts to document everything in a small book of testimonies, my personal chronicle of the ghost train, where I recounted the illusions, the spectral conductor, the sorrowful passenger, and the final ritual, weaving in historical footnotes and the diary entries from others who nearly succumbed. Though I had no plans to publish it publicly, I typed each line with the fervent hope that, should the haunting ever rekindle, future investigators might find the knowledge needed to either quell it again or recognize the signs before it was too late. Life continued with its everyday rhythms, and I found modest happiness in the small joys of normal existence. A steady job, occasional road trips with Morgan, evenings spent stargazing without the looming menace of phantom wheels in the distance, though a nagging voice inside me insisted that no calm ever lasts forever. One chill autumn night, while flipping through television channels, I stumbled upon a ghost hunting show that claimed to investigate legends across the country, and my breath caught when they teased a segment about a phantom locomotive rumored to roam a local forest, the name of the line suspiciously similar to ours. My initial reaction was panic, visions of camera crews trampling the ravine, possibly reigniting the energies we'd pacified with such effort. But then the segment aired, featuring only superficial interviews and no tangible evidence, concluding with a dismissive note that no train manifested, leaving the investigators disappointed. Breathing a sigh of relief, I whispered a silent apology to the restless souls who once rode the ghost train, hoping they were now truly at peace, that no meddling camera team would shatter their tenuous release and resurrect the cycle of sorrow in the old trestle shadows. Over time, the region's tourism ads pivoted from haunted railway come-ons to more pastoral appeals, highlighting hiking trails and scenic overlooks, carefully burying references to the tragedies of yesteryear, and I watched with uneasy acceptance, acknowledging that this was simply how communities heal. Yet the illusions never fully left my mind. Whenever the wind howled late at night or a distant horn from a real train sounded across the valleys, my pulse would spike, and I'd stare into the darkness, half expecting to see an eerie glow weaving through the pines, a conductor's silhouette beckoning me once more. Morgan confessed similar moments of panic, though they subsided in frequency, each episode reminding us that trauma, especially one laced with supernatural undertones, seldom dissipates neatly, but lingers at the edges of perception, waiting for a quiet moment to resurface. To help channel our lingering emotions, we organized a small memorial near the library, inviting locals to bring old photos or stories about the fateful derailment from so many decades ago, focusing on celebrating the lives of those lost rather than sensationalizing the ghostly aftermath. Surprisingly, the event drew a sizable crowd, many coming forward with tearful gratitude, thanking us for acknowledging the forgotten passengers who might otherwise remain overshadowed by the thrill-seeking rumor of a ghost train, and it felt like a balm on old wounds to see the community unite in empathy. An older woman approached me afterward, pressing a worn photograph into my hand, a black-and-white snapshot of a stern-faced conductor standing beside an engine, his uniform neat and his eyes hidden by the glare of the sun, the resemblance to the spectral figure I encountered almost too strong to ignore. She claimed he was her grandfather's brother, rumored to have been on duty the night the train derailed, never found among the wreckage, presumed lost in the raging waters below, and she asked me in a trembling voice if I believed he might still wander those tracks, seeking redemption. Overwhelmed, I didn't have a definite answer, only a soft vow that if he ever roamed in some ghostly state, we had done our best to guide him toward peace, hoping that the last ceremony in the ravine offered him a chance at rest, rather than eternal condemnation. Tears welled in her eyes, and we embraced, sharing a potent silence that transcended the line between lore and lived grief, each of us hopeful that the ephemeral boundary between life and death had been gently closed for that lost soul, granting him a closure he deserved. Walking home under a calm evening sky, I recalled how different the forest looked now, free of the swirling mists and unnerving hush that once accompanied every step near the tracks, replaced by the usual hoots of owls and gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, a normalcy I never thought I'd appreciate so deeply. While the residual fear still sat in my bones, I discovered a renewed sense of purpose. I resolved to keep the memory of the ghost train alive, not as a ghost story for cheap thrills, but as a reminder that tragedies leave imprints we cannot easily dismiss, and that sometimes compassion, understanding, and a bit of courage can loosen even the most persistent chains. Occasionally, in the hush before dawn, I wake to the lingering echo of a whistle in my mind, a half-formed note that fades before I can determine if it's real or imagined. But each time I remind myself that we face the spectral locomotive with open hearts, refusing to let fear alone dictate the outcome of its centuries-long sorrow. As the years roll on, I continue refining my written account of events, the restless souls we encountered, the conductor's ominous silhouette, the ceremony in the ravine, and the letters never delivered, ensuring that if the ghost train's hush returns, the next witness might be armed with knowledge gleaned from both heartbreak and resolve. Morgan sometimes jokes that we could write a book titled Passengers of the Afterlife, Our Journey with the Ghost Train, but we both know the subject is far too precious and personal to commercialize, too intertwined with the silent tears shed by those forever lost on that ill-fated line. On quiet anniversaries, we revisit the old trestle site at midday, placing a wreath where the forest has devoured the rails, murmuring a short prayer for those who still linger in memory, grateful that the ancient gloom has not reclaimed a route for another cycle of haunting. Though it's impossible to guarantee the train will never ride again, I find comfort in a relative peace that has settled over our region, an equilibrium we earn through empathy for the dead, acceptance of the unknown, and a willingness to stand on the threshold between reality and myth. The experience taught me that horror is sometimes the manifestation of unresolved anguish, and that if we care enough to face it head-on, to show compassion for the trapped and the lost, we might just reshape an ancient cycle into something gentler, or at the very least, keep it dormant for generations to come. In fleeting moments of introspection, I recall how the conductor's hollow eyes once pinned me in place, wordlessly threatening to claim me for his endless route, and I feel a deep gratitude that I somehow mustered the will to leave that carriage behind, to fight for the living despite the train's seductive pull. Even now, a piece of me wonders what lay down those corridors beyond my line of sight, what distant station or silent domain the ghost train called home. But I've learned not all questions demand an answer. Some mysteries serve best as cautionary symbols of life's fragile boundary with the beyond. If in the twilight years of my life I hear rumors that the spectral locomotive has surfaced once more, I'd probably gather my notes, that battered silver pendant, and a small circle of believers, ready to repeat whatever exorcism of empathy is required, because once you've touched that realm, ignoring it becomes an impossibility. Until then, I embrace each sunrise as a testament that our intervention held strong, that the passengers found some measure of rest, and that the sorrowful train's final whistle has faded into the quiet recesses of memory, sparing our forest the weight of another generation's haunting. I can't claim to have rid the world of all wandering spirits or undone the tragedies that birthed them, but I believe in my heart that we at least offered the ghost train's forlorn travelers a choice other than perpetual wandering, maybe guiding them toward a station beyond mortal comprehension, where old wounds finally heal. In the end, my greatest solace is in the glimpses of normal life, children laughing in front yards, hikers enjoying the forest trails without fear of phantom lights, and neighbors who no longer speak in hushed tones about midnight whistles echoing in the pines, signs that the gloom once draped over our region has lifted. And if late at night a hush suddenly falls over the land, if thunderless lightning flickers on the horizon, I remind myself that while specters might stir, we too have the resilience to answer them with compassion and courage, repeating the cycle of contrition for all who wander between the grave and the track. Thus, the memory of the ghost train persists, not in the despair of an endless route, but the quiet knowledge that the living and the dead sometimes share the same roads, each side yearning for resolution, and that if we listen closely to the distant hum of unseen wheels, we might just guide each other home.